All right. Great. Can everyone hear me? Okay, super. So, after lunch, start of the afternoon, and first day of a amazing conference to come together to talk about games. Now, in the spirits of talking about games, let's talk about those among us that we most associate with playing games. So, once upon a time, there was a young girl, and she spent her afternoon with the 2 hours of screen time that her parents allow her. And during this screen time, she gets to play games that are based on ancestral knowledge, on the wisdom of those that came before her, and she gets to learn about cultures that extend far beyond her own horizon. Now, these stories that she learns about, they're authentic and people feel represented by them. Now, for the parents that might be here today or the dedicated auntie and uncles, this sounds like a pretty good guilt-free screen time, doesn't it? Now, luckily, there are already a couple of really cool games out there that would allow for a bit of guilt-free screen time. So, taking the example of Never Alone, a game in which an Inupiat girl gets to play with her Arctic fox through the kind of ancestral stories of her Alaskan ancestors. In Elba gets to learn inventive ways to fight climate change. And in Mulaka, we learn about indigenous cultures of Mexico. Unfortunately, the reality of the gaming industry at large far more often sees headlines like this when it comes to cultural representation in games. Oops, that slide really disappeared quite quickly. Now, as recent as 2020, the game Animal Crossing was still accused of poor representation of indigenous culture where the kids got to tame wild islands and wild islanders. Now, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the organization that I'm here to represent, Tails, and how this organization is dedicated to combating such negative stereotyping in any kind of media. So, a tale of tales, if you will, and a tale about a big team spread across the world, all dedicated to telling stories that should be told. We do indeed have a big team, but let me start things with telling the story that is maybe most authentic to me, the story that I might have most authority to talk about, which is how did I get to do this work? How did I end up here to talk about cultural preservation? Now, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm also not an ethnologist. I'm not someone that you might expect in a cultural setting per se. Actually, my career started at the age of 15, which is just a couple of years ago, in advertising. So I worked for many years on big sets to sell coffee colored sodas and phone contracts, and made it as far as getting on sets to, you know, see monster trucks crushing cars to sell men burgers. Now, as a blossoming feminist at the time, I wondered if these skills that I was learning in advertising could also potentially be honed for storytelling with more purpose. So eventually, I applied for film school, and I got to work on films that I was really dedicated to tell these stories, to work with the teams, to tell certain stories to bigger audiences, to really make sure that if we allocate such budget and such time and energy to make something, that it is seen by those who need to see it. Now, since my upcoming in the career that I aspired was really heavily influenced by advertising and was in a time that was the rise of social media, which might date me a little bit. what was the time where things first had to go viral, I always had a foot in both worlds. So the cinema screen is something very romantic, but different ways of storytelling was always very intriguing to me. So transmedia, multimedia, short form, straight to video, a lot of ways to tell stories that go beyond the big screen alone. So in this time, I could say I built a lot of confidence in my work and maybe even the courage to apply for the biggest campaign and land in one of the biggest jobs that I ever got, which was the creation and job to kind of frame a rainforest in Congo. I was hired by a nonprofit organization to help build awareness for the Congo Basin, one of the most important rainforests on the planet. Now, for those among you that might be thinking the word confidence and courage could also be replaced with arrogance, I would say you're absolutely right, because I was definitely not equipped to make an awareness campaign about such a vastly complex and important place. I might not know how cola is made and still know how to sell it, but I was not the person to create a campaign about Congo or to tell these stories. So, with that, I would like to actually acknowledge that what I'm here mostly to talk about is my learnings about when it's not my turn to speak, when it is not my place to tell a story, but the ways I've learned to help tell stories in different forms. Now, in this period, I've also been incredibly grateful for the people around me that have been really critical towards this process and pointed me into directions to learn more about things such as intersectional environmentalism, which is one of the activisms that would acknowledge that storytelling in such forms should always be at the intersection of community, culture, and nature. So a lot of our learnings are inherently intertwined with nature. A lot of the myths that we've been telling for centuries are about natural phenomena. Now, another thing that taught me a lot at this time was a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi. And in her TED Talk, she discussed the danger of a single story. Now, in the danger of a single story, she talks about the danger that is in storytelling, the danger of only knowing one story about a group. And in the single story, we can create stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they're not true, but that they're incomplete. And Congo is actually quite an interesting example. If we look at the image search results of merely Googling the word Congo, we see that the country is very much reduced to its suffering. And a very wise man once told me that if I want to teach you something about me, and say we gain the intimacy, that I would invite you to my home. I wouldn't necessarily show you where there's mold in my carpet or where things are leaking. No, I will show you maybe the photos that I framed or the mementos that I took from my journey. I will show you things that tell you something about me that I want you to learn. Now, in this process of creating an awareness campaign about the Congo Basin, I eventually decided to bring my two worlds together and invite a photographer whose photography is mostly dedicated to photographing some of the world's most celebrated people. So here you see some pictures of A$AP Rocky, Kristen Stewart, Lady Gaga. You can say that he literally went from Gaga to Congo with us. And together with a big community, we co-created a photography project in which we selected 22 stories together with community voices that most represent the complex, vast, and rich culture of the Congo Basin. Now, this turned into a book, which became a traveling exhibition, which also became a short film, which was celebrated the world over in the press as a different story that can be told about the Congo, making it as far as even the cover of the New York Times, PBS News, celebrated on BBC, and actually eventually giving birth to what Tales has become today. Now, Tales is an organization really dedicated to finding ways to tell stories like this. And as we've been at it for 10 years, I'd like to share a little show reel of our work. We haven't tested the audio, so fingers crossed it's gonna work. It doesn't. But imagine really cool music. Yeah? Okay, great. So with the lack of music, I'm going to skip through it a little quicker and talk a little bit about, ooh, it's suggesting audio. Like if you're pressing the wrong button. All right, so moving on to our organization, which was rooted in film and photography, and one could say more traditional forms of media, into gaming. Now, I'm sure we all remember that 2020 was a year in which things drastically changed for all of us. So it was a year that made us really stop and think, if we are able to find funding to tell certain stories, to whom must these stories now be told? And which audience might have the biggest priority to create content for and with? So we quickly agreed that this would be kids. Kids whose worlds were suddenly reduced to a lot of screen time and staying at home a lot. So together with our team, we decided to start building what is now become a multiplayer game called World of Us. Slower than I thought. Now, World of Us is a game about the world and for the world. But let's get a little bit more pragmatic today about this reimagination of conservation of culture through gaming. Because what I would like to talk about a little bit more is about really the practical process of creating something like this. And there's a sentence that I always like to highlight in such moments, which is that nothing about us without us is for us. And as such, for us, methods of co-creation and collective authorship versus this traditional single author approach became extremely formative for the way we created World of Us, the game. Now, in World of Us, the game, we developed multiple participatory development trajectories, which is an extremely hard thing to say, but I've said it many times, so that came out fluently. But in these participatory development trajectories, we found ways to co-create. Now, co-creation is an incredibly complex process, as we're also taught to work in certain hierarchies, and of course, these are things that do not necessarily have the traditional blueprints or the team setup, such as having an art director, or a specific game developer, or an environment designer. So we kind of had to reinvent the wheel in this process a little bit. So to tell you a little bit more about how this process has gone and showing you a little bit of the images, what we did was we brought together in 4 places of great ecological importance national game development teams with cultural representatives as well as academic experts and different community voices. And together we worked on specifically facilitated workshops that helped us collectively imagine how kids could learn in the form of a game about these different cultures. We did this in Romania, in the Danube Delta, which is one of the most important wetlands in Europe, in Congo, where we once started, in the Amazon in Brazil, and in Kerala and the Western Ghats area in India. So, highlighting a few of the members of this participatory art direction trip, one would be Professor Nikolai Kraichun. Thought I stepped on an audio. No. Who is a Danube Delta expert, but also an excellent storyteller, so much so that some of the myths that he told about the big sturgeon fish in the region made it that not our entire games team joined for the canoe trip the next day. We got to borrow Juris, who is the senior environment designer on the AAA Black Panther Marvel game at the moment, originally from Congo, who joined us for a week into the Congo Basin, during which he, amongst others, worked with Mr. Pambu, royal representative of the Congo Basin, as well as a scholar and writer, an excellent storyteller, who told juries very small details about things such as seeds or things such as hand gestures, and really talked about how can we respectfully teach children in a game setting about these very important parts of the heritage of the Congo Kingdom. In Brazil, we worked with the Yawanawa community in the Yawanari village, represented by their spiritual leader, Shanehu. Now, I wanted to show a couple of cool shots of our team there as well. But we went in winter, so most of us looked like this all the time because it was extremely riddled with very violent mosquitoes. I was bitten in my eyelids and looked like this most of the time. So I don't remember seeing, but I remember experiencing a lot and seeing the work that teams brought back dedicated to finding ways to bring Urupum into the game was really powerful. Now, I wanted to share a clip today in which Shanehu also speaks about how important digital media is, even in settings such as the Amazon, where we might imagine really traditional settings of people sitting around a campfire, but in truth, people are doing TikTok dances just the same, are enjoying their screen time just the same, and as such, see much more urgency to see themselves represented in ways they're actually engaged with. So I'll skip
A
this
gente
video.
sabe que o audiovisual ela dá uma visibilidade para a geração atual com mais interesse do que outras coisas. E o Yawanawá não está diferente das demais crianças que estão nos centros urbanos por conta da internet. Para nós, liderança, nos preocupa que a educação, que a história Yawanawá não se perca com o tempo. Então, a partir desses trabalhos, ela começa também a ser, de uma certa forma, um arquivo que está sendo exposto, que está sendo guardado e que está sendo olhado não só pelas crianças de Yawanawá, mas pelo mundo.
So, diving a little bit into our participatory art direction experience here in India, where we, amongst others, worked with Vinod. Vinod is the first PhD student of his tribe, the Cholokanaikon, which is kind of an elusive cave dweller, forest dweller population that is slowly fading away, but known to have incredible knowledge about Ayurvedic culture, about the flora and fauna of the Western Ghats region, which is, of course, one of the most biodiverse regions of India. Now, we teamed them up with these absolute zaddies from Antariksh Studio, who worked together with Vinod on imagining ways to tell stories in island settings and in gamified forms to teach children about this culture. And together with many more team members, such as an excellent audio team, we got to also record some of the songs that the women sing in the Wayanad region of South India, which they dedicate mostly to thanking Mother Earth. And in collaborative settings, we were able to process these songs in game forms and in educational forms so that children the world over, but also here in India, get to learn a little bit more about them. Now, I wanted to end on a little bit further of an anecdote about this process in India that better illustrates why these trajectories are so important, where these moments of participatory coming together to co-create can be extremely impactful for any game that you might want to create. So this is just one of the many pictures that we took from alongside the road, from kind of wildlife that was very close to urban roads quite often. And to me, it really felt like I was on a movie set and someone accidentally left open all the cages and all the animals really just rushed all over the place. But in truth, this is the result of the yellow lanterna, which is an invasive species which you can see all across the region, which were once brought by British settlers to this region. And little did they know that this species would be extremely aggressive for all the flora and fauna in its surroundings. And as such, really pushes wildlife into urban areas, which has lots of course, really disastrous consequences. That was the word. And as such, it really sparked this understanding of, okay, we're building a game about the world in which we're thinking about, redefining borders, really identifying people as localities over nationhood, really thinking about, maybe an indigenous person in Brazil wouldn't necessarily identify as Brazilian, but more so as their, cultural community. And as such, we really had to kind of rethink about, okay, how will we also plan in our world? Because if we teach kids that this is a utopic world where animals and plant life can all just blend and we're all together, we'll teach them a false narrative. So this really essentially meant that we had to go back to the drawing board. And this is something that actually had to happen quite often in this process, but it was a very grateful process because it really, really gave us, lots of insights, lots of expansion, lots of understanding of importance, whereas we might think, oh, borders should be rethought and what do they mean anyway? For a person, again, in the Amazon, borders are extremely important. So in the spirits of show, don't tell, I want to show you a very, very first preview of a very first version of the opening cutscene of our game. That's nice. So, to end today, there are 5 things that our team really pulled out of this process. Number 1, we feel that it's incredibly important to be students of our own project in the first place. So, approach your content with humility. Really take your time for research and take time to understand. Take the reflections and the conversations really serious. Number 2, center voices from within the culture. Nothing captures authenticity like involving those who are part of the culture. Now, number 3 is a very important one because, as you've heard me say in the beginning of my talk today, we're making a game about the world for the world. Now, naturally, we had to reduced it quite significantly. So volume 1 is about 4 first important areas of our planet. And this is also something that I would really advise you to really try to scale accordingly. Number 4 is to establish an ethical framework. Adopt these guiding principles for cultural representation. So in these cases, also think about things such as how do you remunerate the people that you work with? Who can you ask to donate their time versus who should you truly take serious as a contributor to the way you shape your game? The conversations that you have in which people impart wisdom to you are incredibly valuable. So think about how to remunerate for that. And the last one, the going back to the drawing board, is iterate with openness and feedback. We for sure had a hard time with this. We for sure had moments where we're like, oh, but it's worth it. And especially if you're dedicated to education, if you're dedicated to co-creation and working together to tell stories that should be told, to tell stories that have historically not been told in the right way or not been told at all. Because with all of this together, if we think about our medium, and if we would deny or ignore that our games and their carried values influence mindshare, then we would reject the very power of our medium. Now, this is a quote from legendary culturalization specialist Kate Edwards, and the final words from her are, content carries culture. Culture carries values, and values catalyze change. And with that, I would thank you so much for listening today to this talk about reimagination of cultural representation through games, and also thank you to the IDGC for having us here today. Hey! And I think we even have 13 minutes to spare the screen. Yay! Hi!
So we employ participatory design in our process. We do nothing about us without us. I think one of the challenges that we face, and I believe we touched on some of it already, but I'd like to kind of dig in there, is the gap that exists between like working with people who are not designers, who are not makers of these things, and how do you bring them along on a process that they might not be.
So we try to, so I would just repeat the question in case not everyone heard it. So the question is, how do you cater such processes of involvement to people that are maybe not so agnostic or with the medium of gaming, or just not gamers themselves, or really not having ever been exposed to gaming. So in the process of developing our participatory trajectory, see, it's still hard to say, we really thought about gameplay in these processes. So in the video, you also see us standing and you see us imagining things, and we brought the kids of the communities, because kids nowadays really know. Like it's hard to find communities, and if it is that hard to find them, that they have not had any exposure to mobile gaming, maybe they don't want to necessarily be found. So that's something to think about. But for us, no matter how deep we also went into the rainforest in Congo, for example, we would find mobile games. So we would try to cater intimate settings during which we could also talk with kids about this and really take them serious as contributors also, but also just have physical gameplay. Board games are really as old as time, and this recognition overall that, the digital world is really here to stay and such a powerful tool to also be a partaker in. I felt that very strongly with all communities, so there's a big openness, but there's definitely sometimes a lot of sensitivity that should be there. And I find one thing that is very important in such settings is try to bring people together that speak the same language very practically. As soon as you start talking, like start working with maybe talks or interpreters, it takes already a lot of intimacy away for people to feel comfortable in a setting like that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Hi.
So there's two questions. The first question is if I could talk a little bit more about the ethical frameworks that we have in place already, if any. And the second question is just with cross-cultural issues potentially. So to talk a little bit about the first one, so every framework is custom to the situation. So one thing that we've learned also in developing the participatory art direction, we actually started calling it PADS, just so I know we didn't always say the whole thing, but it's that we had one kind of baseline, which is understanding payment structures, time, really things like that, but also understanding the setting. So we also learned that, hey, we may enter certain settings where we can't just give people money because it might have a lot of ripple effects that we are unaware of. So make sure that within this approach that we have the right people that can also be trusted and can inform us about such decision making. And yeah, for that, I really can mostly say that it was so different. And also in some situations, people really didn't need money. They just needed a boat. And the boat was incredibly helpful. And there was just a return of like knowledge sharing. And then we bought a boat, for example. Like it was very unique to the situation. The advice that I would give there is to really do your research on the people that can inform you and the people that have the authority to inform you. Because there's a lot of people are also, of course, opinionated, or people might also be influenced by different settings. We also experience this a lot. We also experience this a lot in India, from different cultural organizations. There are different agendas. So, try to take your time. If it takes longer, take longer. Don't take shortcuts. When it comes to cross-cultural, we haven't had very specific issues yet, as we, for example, don't work necessarily politically. So as a game, we don't take specific political statements, but there are thoughts, of course. So also in doing our research, for example, and in the final quote by Kate Edwards in one of her talks, she also speaks about the choices you made. Like, for example, the choice that the Barbie movie made with how they show the map of China and Taiwan, you say something with that. So as a team, you have to try to get on the same page. And, there's certain considerations that you make, but there are, of course, values that you communicate. Even if you culturalize it and make it different for different settings, there's still something that you might say with that. And that it's really up to you to, co-create the values that you find most important for the game and really stick to them. So in an ethical framework, those values are also very important. Does that answer the question a little bit? Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Audible? I wanted to ask, when it comes to adapting cultures, especially in a media like games, how do you deviate from the stereotypical interpretations of those cultures and at the same time stay authentic to like representing them in a most appropriate way possible for the audience to understand, like, okay, this comes from this specific area of like Indian subcontinent.
Specifically about the Indian subcontinent you were asking?
For this question, yes. Like, if I were to adapt a South Indian tribe for a game, and I want to represent South Indian culture, but I also want to like adapt for people to know that this is South India, but at the same time for them to be like, okay, this is, it shouldn't be confusing and understood at the same time. How do you approach that understanding?
So it is definitely something very difficult, because also, for example, if we work in the Western Ghat area here in India, which is extremely diverse when it comes to the tribal communities there, we also learned that many people speak completely different languages, have completely different diets, so you can't talk either in this locality about tribal communities without doing some injustice to their identity. And we worked also with cultural advisors on this, and their advice was to specifically frame it was just not being specific enough is no representation. So we chose, for example, to just have NPCs very specifically based on a character or one culture, so that we learn that that is that culture, that it's not someone that represents a whole, but that that is an individual person, and we maybe learn about their family. And the premise for us was, if World of Us is a way for children to kind of virtually travel, and if we think about our experiences with traveling, what is the most sentiment that we have from that is maybe sometimes we got to know someone from the country and they taught us something. So we really kind of enjoy having met this individual and having eaten at their home or something like this. And to make it personal like that, we feel is the strongest way to represent the cultures in our game without generalizing that, because that will always be a challenge. We want to teach about different places and different areas, but when it comes to culture, we try to personalize it through, for example, kind of water body NPCs as well that represent the water of this cultural identity. That makes sense.
Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hi. So my question is a little personal based on my experience. So I went to fashion college in Kerala, and over there we have like a 6 month period where we go to indigenous tribes and learn their crafts and understand and how we can bring it down to the world. My personal problem when I had like I'm not from Kerala, so I don't speak the language. My personal problem was how like when you approach people from indigenous communities, they're very closed off to people from outside. They don't particularly trust them, and that was one of the problems. So how did you approach tribes like these, and what kind of uh, systems you kind of use to get them to trust you, to tell their stories? Because once they trust you, they do tell you everything. Even if you don't want to know, but they do tell you everything.
Yeah.
So it was like a long process for me. For like the 6 months, 3 months of it was just me getting to like, trust me, and the rest 3 months of the work. So how did you approach that?
Well, in the process of, for example, working here in India, very specifically, I wouldn't be part of these processes personally, but we decided in this case to really make sure that we have a team and really try to find people also speak the same language, maybe not natively, but that speak a language that is shared. And 3 months, sometimes this is really the time that it takes, and that's the kind of iteration and research time and being a student that that this work can take, and that should be anticipated. At the same time, of course, we didn't always also necessarily have this time, so we approached fixers and producers from Kerala, people that could help us find these exchanges or really become part of these exchanges. So have moments where we would make audio recordings and transcribe them and make sure that maybe a conversation that was held between people that already had some intimacy, that maybe already took those 3 months. There's no shortcut in that, because I think the intimacy also, it teaches you something beyond that, because if it's so quickly and if it then also fades away, then maybe there's a risk of still it being exploitative in a form, right? Where you learn something about the craft and you don't maybe understand the need to truly take the representation in a form that could also bring things back or include or. Hey, 45 seconds. We did it. Fine. Okay.
Hello, ma'am. For this particular game, World of Us, did you face any problems based on the freedom taken to have cultural representation towards interactive fun games? So you would make it fun to have artistic liberties, and but you want to have the culture represented in a more accurate way, but also have fun and change towards a fun way for games. So any problems faced towards that, or
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a really good question. And Nene, my colleague who is also here, she's always saying like, "Ah, we're a little bit of rule breakers because we kind of, reinvent the wheel." And I would compare it to a shoe brand. It's like we're architects and we didn't know how to make shoes, but we still did it, and we're kind of the same. We have a background of different ways of approach. But yeah, starting from we want to make an educational game, it very quickly became chocolate covered broccoli, like just school wrapped in kind of like a prettier jacket. And obviously kids don't like that, and they're way too smart to just be like, oh yeah, a quiz? Yeah. So we definitely had iterations there as well. And with this kind of fine line of, representation and accuracy therein, there is a part of fantasy. So this is the collective memory of the world where the water remembers. So what you play, you're kind of a water body that comes to save the world, and because the water is the way we traveled and the water is kind of what ties us, that's what we chose. And I do think like games in the first place, they have to be fun. So we definitely have the people that are really, really there to just be like, yeah, no, the kids are not gonna like this. Like we should understand them. And actually, we do a lot of playtesting, and I'm so surprised because we work with people that are in the peak of the gaming industry that donate their time to us, and they tell us that there's so little actual testing where you just go sit and where kids hurt your feelings, and it's important in the process so that you can then just take it back and try to do a little bit better again. So in that, it's yeah, we made certain choices towards fiction part, this mythical part, the power of earth and the memory of water. And then at the same time, yeah, man, we can fly in the world, we can surf over the water. It's really fun. I hope you all get to play it with your kids at some point. Thank you. Thank you all.